Multi-hazards, all about protecting communities.
Hello, this is the Multi-Hazards podcast, where we take a deep dive into issues in emergency management, climate change adaptation, security, etc. And the overarching objective here is protecting communities. So welcome, Vin Nelson here. Today, I am so thrilled to have a special guest, Alex Valoroso. Alex Valoroso is a senior advisor of emergency management strategic partnerships at Emergency Management British Columbia, EMBC. She has experience in gender and disaster management, as well as a wide variety of skills as an accomplished humanitarian professional. Alex holds a Bachelor of Arts BA in International Development with a focus on community development, a master's degree in disaster and emergency management with focus on gender and disaster, and certificates in shelter and settlement coordination in emergencies, addressing gender-based violence in emergencies, and international humanitarian law. Her most recent accomplishment includes GenderPro, a specialized technical program at George Washington University. Alex volunteers as the vice president of her local Women's Resource Center and has recently spearheaded a Women in Leadership initiative for her community. Dedicated to working with communities, Alex has extensive practitioner experience in emergency management throughout BC and during various responses in Canada. Besides her current role as a senior advisor at EMBC, Emergency Management British Columbia, she is a gender equity advisor through the provincial government's Gender Equity Office. In the past, Alex provided technical support as a gender specialist with QSO International in Guyana, South America, participated in an emergency mission for the refugee crisis in Tanzania, Africa, with Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF International, also known as Doctors Without Borders in English, and provided expertise during various responses as a coordinator with the Canadian Red Cross. An added disclaimer here, Alex speaks from her experience and not for the government of British Columbia in this podcast. So, dear listeners, it's my habit here on each and every Multi-Hazards podcast to say a territorial acknowledgement. This is out of deep respect for the First Nations people on whose land I podcast, here in the suburbs of Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. I'm borrowing the text from the nearby Kwantlen Polytechnic University, or KPU. So here we go. We work, study, and live in a region south of the Fraser River, which overlaps with the unceded, traditional, and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katzie, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikite, and Kwikwetlam peoples. These are the names of various First Nations groups around me here in Greater Vancouver, here on the west coast of Canada. Now, without further ado, let's get to the interview. So welcome to our guest, Alex Valoroso. So hi, Alex. Good to have you here on the program.
Great. Thank you, Vin. Nice to be here.
Okay, great. So now I'm just wondering, how are you doing in these crazy COVID-19 times?
Yeah, I'm all right. I'm waiting and watching not only to see how we're doing in the midst of COVID, but also as we wait for the ongoing seasonal hazards. But before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that I am calling in from the traditional territory of the Lataco Dene, on whose land I'm a guest on.
Oh, great. You know, you're the only one who does that. I do it for myself, but that's great. So now let's just kick off with the questions. I'm wondering, how did you get into emergency management? Because that's your profession.
Yeah. So I work in emergency management, and I had always wanted to work in the humanitarian sector. And although it was originally about development work, the more I started to gain experience in disaster management, I realized the linkages between long-term recovery and development were connected to disasters. And it's also just, I think, for me, a natural extension of the humanitarian sector. And to be honest, emergencies are complex events with many layers, and I find it really fascinating.
Right. Okay. And now you're a specialist. I've seen that with what was it? Even with my school, Justice Institute of British Columbia, and some other places, you've done webinars, and so you're a specialist in gender and disaster. So I'm wondering, how did you get into these gender issues?
Yeah, well, specialist, that's always a funny word for me. I think it's, I probably would know more about this subject matter than some people, but definitely I'm not, I wouldn't,
Okay.
at the top there. But yeah, so gender, I didn't originally start with gender, but the more I learned about development work and about complex emergencies, I started to see how men and women were impacted as well as girls and boys. And again, there were these links to gender-based violence, which couldn't be ignored. It was actually quite frustrating to see it, and the general insecurity faced by women, girls, men, and boys during these events. And to be honest, if we don't look at gender and really at all intersecting identities and barriers, then we are perpetuating inequities regardless of the sector.
Right, right. I've even seen online, there's some news articles saying that with the COVID-19 lockdowns in the last, 3 months, there's also been a rise in domestic violence. So yeah, it's a
Yeah,
huge issue. So
yeah. The UN has termed it, I believe it's a shadow pandemic, because it's alongside this event that's long term. It's been going on, and we're not really addressing it. I think we're starting to recognize it, but it's a huge concern for sure.
right, right. Now, so what would you say is the number one problem that's related to gender and disasters?
Well, I would say that here in Canada, it's the lack of disaggregated data by sex and age at the minimum. And if we don't know who is being impacted or how or why, then our interventions aren't based in evidence, and it becomes about assumptions on what to do. I will say, however, that we almost never need to wait for data to identify if there's gender-based violence happening, because research and statistics have proven that GBV occurs and is actually increased during and after disasters. So that's really the only case we don't really need to wait for the data. But even if we look at COVID, I think in the news, given the last couple of weeks around recent events, we can see that communities of color, people of color, Black and Indigenous peoples have been disproportionately impacted by COVID, but we don't have a lot of strong data around why. We make assumptions around that. And of course, we can look at institutional racism and those types of inequities, but it would be good to really pinpoint what's happening.
Yeah, I've seen some news articles saying that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for international listeners, RCMP, they're across Canada. They've and I guess 911, they've received a lot more phone calls during the last 2 or 3 months because of domestic violence. So I don't know
Yeah.
if that counts as formal data, but
Yeah, I think it's really important to capture that. And I think the other challenge across the board is that organizations don't want to or necessarily have the capacity to dedicate the time in the midst of a disaster to collect data, because they're operational and have competing priorities. And so often we'll hear like, now's not the time, but that's exactly when we need to gather data and to analyze it.
maybe there needs to be other people, like sort of like journalists come into a disaster and do some video taking, or photographers. Maybe somebody needs to just swoop in and do data only.
Well, there's actually a rapid gender assessment that could be done, and it is done internationally on the onset of disaster. So I'm hoping that that could be a tool that is adopted and implemented here in Canada.
Okay. Now, how exactly do women get more affected by disasters than men, assuming that they do?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that women are more affected, but more so there are different types of impacts which are rooted in gender inequities and then exacerbated during times of crisis or disaster. Women and girls are disproportionately impacted by disaster in several ways, and we need to look at those various intersecting factors. So, for example, women of color and Indigenous women may experience increased negative impacts due to systemic racism and legacies of colonization. And the main impacts tend to include an increase in gender-based violence, as we discussed, but there's also the lack of secure housing, expectations around child and elder care, and lack of financial security. And, men are also impacted, and that's why it's important to do an analysis and understand the context in which we're working in.
Right. And just for our international listeners, they might not understand when North Americans, Canadians, Americans say women of color or people of color. That's typically people without European ancestry whose skin is not white, even though there are people who are not European who also have white skin. So it's just a word that we use in Canada and the US. Am I right there, Alex?
I mean, yeah, I think the term that we use, non-white individuals, racialized minorities, which can also be a troublesome term, indigenous peoples.
That's here we call
Yeah.
First Nations. Yeah.
Yeah, well, indigenous actually captures First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and so First Nations is very specific, and indigenous is a bit of an umbrella term. And so we just want to ensure that, because even though in BC we have a large representation of First Nations populations, there are still Métis and Inuit peoples who live here, and so we don't want to ignore anyone. And that's actually another impact, is like, how are these different groups represented, and are we looking at those different pieces that can also impact them?
Right. That's very important. Now, I'm living in the big city. Well, in Canada, we call it a big city. If you compare to other countries, not that big. But Vancouver, I think it's like, what, 3+ million. And we do have so many smaller cities and towns here in British Columbia, Alberta, different places. Now, I'm wondering if women in smaller cities and towns, they get affected differently than urban women.
They can be. It's really context specific, but if you think of who has access to resources, where those resources exist, the mobility, what is the current situation on food security, safe housing, economic stability, safe or accessible transportation, as well as cultural norms. Each community or region has its own way of existing. And when I say community, I also mean the shared spaces we experience together, so we can have multiple communities at the same time. And all these factors play a role and can contribute to differences for impacts related to geographic regions. Again, it's this intersectional approach, and looking at rural, urban, even indigenous, rural and urban, remote, helps identify the different factors at play. And we need to look at that and understand it before making assumptions and before taking action, because you're right, maybe what works in Vancouver, in a particular region in Vancouver, because we know, for example, East Vancouver is much different than Cole Harbour, that won't necessarily work in a community such as Lawrence Lake or perhaps Quesnel. And what would work in Quesnel maybe is not going to work in Prince George or in Fort Nelson.
Right. Now, you said the word intersection. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. She is a woman of color. She is a professor, and she really identified these different barriers and varying identities that people experience. And this came from her research around a woman, a Black woman, who was not able to get work because she was a woman, but also was excluded from jobs because she was Black. But nobody was looking at those two intersecting factors. They just kind of said, well, women are working and Black people are working, so what's your problem? And so really this idea of intersectionality is to identify those barriers really that people can experience based on their identities. And so if we just look at men as men and women as women without looking at gender, without looking at ethnicity, at looking at like rural, urban, looking at disability, like there's all these different pieces around it. And if we don't take those factors into consideration, we risk really making problems worse, especially at a policy level. So we have to understand where people are at and where they're coming from. And particularly here in Canada, where we have, unfortunately, this legacy of colonization, which continues to impact particularly Indigenous peoples. And so any policies or programs that we put into place really need to take that into account.
Right. And just for our international listeners, when we say colonization, basically this is from, say, 200, or in BC, it's more like, say, 150 or 180 years ago, when basically British people and others from Europe came in and basically took over the land here and then they even called it British Columbia. We still call it that. So in fact, we're not an official colony of Britain. We're an independent country, Canada now, but we still have all this, I don't know if you can call it heritage, but legacy. We have all these influences that extend through many, many decades until now.
Yeah, yeah. And so, first contact, I think, was early as the mid to late 1400s. And, through initially fur trading and also through military conquest, and then wanting to create the concept and idea of Canada. What that has meant for Indigenous peoples has not been positive, and colonization is it's not something that it happened in the past, but it continues to happen today. And if anyone is interested, they can, look up the Indian Act, look up residential schools. Actually, what I could do is provide some resources for your listeners if they want to learn a little bit more. There's some great links that we have to help support education and awareness that can be shared. And I think there are also many Canadians who are not aware of the history of Canada, so it's important to begin that process.
Right, exactly. Now, I was listening to a couple of other podcasts that you had made with Epic and Exclusion, and you were talking about recovery, and that women often have a different role than men because, for example, they might have richer social networks, they might have different recovery activities. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I guess in a way, it's not that they have different roles, but there may be these societal expectations on the types of roles that women take on. And this can either be willingly or part of an exception. So often we see in response to recovery that women are the community organizers and are responsible for rebuilding those social networks and connections back. I think this is often related to the work women have done around civil society organizing to create better circumstances for their families, their communities, or to improve societal impact. And this can also be in part due to how childcare and elder care are gendered, and rebuilding communities in this sense is linked to the overall welfare of the family and society. It's part of rebuilding that social fabric. And then there are some traditionally gendered roles where we see women reestablishing the household, but that could be due not only to gendered expectations, but also economic impacts, where in a dual-headed hetero household, men do tend to make more money than women, so it's a financial decision as well. And again, it's kind of these underlying factors that we need to examine to understand what's going on and why.
Right. Now, I don't want to go over the time, so just wondering if you have one last message for our audience.
Yeah, I think for me, it's that it's never too late to learn or to start implementing gender and intersectionality into your work. And to stay current, there's so many ways to update your training and knowledge, but to also get out there and volunteer with different organizations, network with people, ask questions, understand the type of work you want to do, either as like a practitioner or academic, and start doing info sessions, start going to conferences if you can, even though I guess right now it'll be virtually. Read journal articles and be well-rounded. And really, I'm available if anyone wants to chat or learn more. I'm always happy to share this message.
Right. Great. That's so good. And I know, yeah, there's a lot of webinars happening in all different kinds of topics these days. It's hard to even have time for that with homeschooling children and getting everything else done. So, well, thank you so much, Alex. I really appreciate the time. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners have too. So I wish you a great week and weekend, and take care.
Thanks, Ben, and thank you, everyone, and stay safe out there.
Okay, thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye.
There it is, an insightful interview with Alex Valoroso. Thank you again, Alex, for being a special guest here at the Multi-Hazards podcast. So a little disclaimer here added to the end of every episode. This podcast is meant to be educational and does not try to offer legal, medical, or other specific advice unless otherwise noted. Also, the opinions expressed here do not necessarily reflect those of the organizations that the host, that's me, Vin Nelson, or guests are part of. So, here as I finish this episode, thanks to all of you precious listeners for tuning in today. Stay safe out there and stay tuned for more. This is Vin Nelson wishing you the best on your journey of surviving and thriving with all that life throws at you. Cheers to you all. Peace out.